The reality is that I think we've gotten very good in the private sector at looking at, maximizing shareholder value, maximizing investment returns. We haven't gotten nearly as good in the social sector in terms of maximizing impact.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode, as well as free training on creativity, over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Mei Chang. Mei is the author of Lean Impact, How to Innovate for Radically Greater Social Good. After leaving a long-time career as a Silicon Valley executive that included stints at Google, Apple, Intuit, and a number of startups, she served as Chief Innovation Officer at both USAID, which is the US Foreign Aid Agency, and Mercy Corps, which is a global non-profit. And it's my great pleasure to have Mei with us today. So welcome, Mei.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be with you.
So share with everyone what's happening in your world just now.
Well, over the last couple of years, what I've been immersed in is writing this book called Lean Impact. And it's a book that really looks at how we can take the best practices of innovation that came out of Silicon Valley that have led to this accelerated pace of progress and direct it to something more important, which is social good. How can we make the world a better place? And so I've been doing research for the book, writing the book, and now in the process of promoting the book and getting the ideas out there at the hopes of helping anyone who's trying to do more good in their life, whether it's through their work, through their donations, or through their volunteering, to be able to magnify their impact.
Now, I give it a little bit of a quick overview there of your career, but I mean, how did you get into being particularly interested in innovation, especially innovation working in kind of social causes? Where did that begin?
Well, I have to rewind quite a ways back, but I studied in college as a software engineer. And so for the first 23 years of my career after college, I worked in the tech sector, and worked at various different tech companies as you described. As a part of that, was able to experience, some of the most cutting edge, most creative, most innovative companies in the world and learn from, I think, some of the most brilliant people on the planet. And so I was very fortunate to have that experience. But during most of that time, I would say for probably 20 years of those 23 years, I'd had in my mind that I wanted to do something more meaningful in my life, that something that, where I could give back to the world. And I was doing that certainly in time that I would volunteer outside of work, but I wanted to make the core of what I did. So I sort of hatched this plan, about 20 years ago, that I wanted to spend the first half of my career in the tech sector, and spend the second half of my career doing something that was more meaningful. And so about 7 years ago, I decided to make that shift. I ended up going to the State Department initially through a program called the Franklin Fellowship, and I called it my custom master's in public policy. Rather than going back to school, I decided to actually go and work on the job and learn from people who are actually doing and working with a whole bunch of different organizations. And one thing led to another. Eventually, I ended up at USAID in what I thought of as my dream job as a chief innovation officer there.
I know you've worked obviously in very large tech companies like the Googles and the Apples of this world, Intuit, and then you've also worked with real startups, and you've kind of those kind of bootstrapped, Silicon Valley startups. When you first came into the world of working with, let's say, the more NGO sector and more social good causes, what was your take? What were the big differences that you noticed in those first few weeks?
Do you mean like in the sort of nonprofit sector or in government?
Actually, in both the government and the non-profit sector, and actually explain the kind of other differences between those two, and especially how they view innovation. How is innovation viewed in the government side of things? How is innovation viewed in those kind of larger non-profit organizations?
So I think really exciting is these days, everyone is talking about innovation, whether you're in the most stodgy government institution or at a scrappy nonprofit. Everybody recognizes that with things changing as fast as they are in the world, we all need to innovate in order to, keep up, let alone get ahead. And so innovation is in everybody's lexicon these days. That said, working in government or a nonprofit is very different culture, very different context than working in Silicon Valley. I went from Google to the State Department, and while there are some similarities, they're both large institutions with great influence. Their cultures are dramatically different. Google's a very bottoms-up culture. It's a very kind of data-driven, agile culture. Government is very top-down culture, driven much more by experts than by data, and not the most nimble.
So one of the things I know that they do at Google is they're very focused on OKRs, objectives and key results, and that's like from all levels, and it's in different ways. I think in Intuit also they were very do a lot of that kind of OKR. So when you kind of went into the world of especially the like for example USA Foreign Aid, Mercy Corps as well, did they think about things like a very kind of data driven like OKRs, or is this something that you try to start doing, or was that not appropriate in terms of what you were trying to do with them?
So it was something that I tried to introduce in the different places that I worked. I think that OKRs, and John Doerr has a book out that came out recently about OKRs, are a really valuable way to both get everybody on the same page, set aspirational goals and drive innovation. I believe that, people think a lot about innovation as that kind of big idea, but I think that what drives innovation is a willingness to take risk and a willingness to think out of the box. And some people do that instinctively, but for most people, there's no reason to do that if you can be successful with business as usual. And so what OKRs do is to set a goal that is something that is beyond what you could achieve with business as usual. And when you have a goal that you can't get there by doing what you're doing today, it forces you to think out of the box, and it forces you to take some risks. And so I think of those sort of audacious goals as the birthplace of innovation. If you think about, Kennedy's call to send a man to the moon, it's these kinds of, goals that inspire us to stretch ourselves and to try to do something that we might not have thought was possible.
Now, you mentioned that word taking risks. When I think of nonprofits, taking risks are not the first thing I tend to think of. With the from the outsider's perspective, they look like quite risk adverse types of organizations. Am I right in saying that, or have I got the wrong take on this? And if they are risk adverse, how do you start introducing this idea of risk, especially if something that's very kind of funder focused and in terms of their thinking, their process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's true that government is very risk averse, and for good reason. Government is responsible for our taxpayer money and needs to spend it responsibly, and we hold government rightfully accountable to spending it responsibly. And so, of course, we're not happy when government wastes our hard-earned taxpayer money. So, but I don't think that means we can't take risk. It means that I think we need to be thoughtful about how we take risk. And I think that's even true in Silicon Valley startup companies. So I think risk needs to be measured. So the degree of risk you take needs to be sort of appropriate for where you are. One of the things that we did at USAID is at the lab at USAID, which is the part of USAID that I was working in, is that we set up a number of new funding mechanisms that were a bit different than how we traditionally funded in government, that were tiered and evidence-based. And a lot of them were modeled essentially after the way venture capital works. So this is like our Development Innovation Ventures, or DIV, the Global Innovation Fund, and our family of grand challenges. And what we did with each of those was to lower the sort of initial barrier to entry, to have much larger number of smaller grants that we could give out. And that allowed us to take more risk, to kind of place a lot more bets, knowing that not all of them would succeed. But then the ones that did get traction, that did show evidence of impact, then we would double down on those. So if you imagine when you give out like a bunch of $100,000 grants, you can take a lot more risk than you're giving out a $10 million or $100 million grant. And so that allowed us to try a lot more different things. And then, but if we were, when we failed, we would fail small, not fail big.
Yeah. So then, I don't know, in the world of nonprofits, for let's say an outside investor, let's say if I'm a large trust or a family trust, for example, and I have $1 million every year that I want to allocate to giving to nonprofits and those types of causes, Is there the equivalent of, something like Warren Buffett we talk about, if you're not going to be an active investor, just invest in an index fund that can basically take a percentage, or a Ray Dalio say just have an all weather fund. In the world of non-profits, is there very evidence-based where I can say, okay, I have this portfolio of investments in non-profits and I want a percentage to go to this, index in that's going to be lower risk here, and overall it should see the kind of returns on that investment, however you define those terms. Does that exist in the non-profit world?
I love the way you think. It's actually something that I would love to see more of. It exists to some extent, but not nearly to the extent that I think it should. The reality is that I think we've gotten very good in the private sector at looking at maximizing shareholder value, maximizing investment returns. We haven't gotten nearly as good in the social sector in terms of maximizing impact. And I think that's something that we really need to think more about. And so I'm a big fan. There's a number of different donor collaboratives where people can come together, pool their funds, and have it kind of professionally managed, after either a particular issue area that people are jointly interested in, sort of manage it, like you might a mutual fund, or, kind of bring it together to try to affect systems change. And so I think that those kinds of mechanisms allow us to get much more bang for the buck, because right now a lot of donations are very splintered, doing a lot of duplicative things that are not necessarily at scale. One exciting one that is fairly recent is something called Co-Impact, that was started by a woman named Olivia, who used to run the Giving Pledge. And it's bringing together large philanthropists to look at investing in successful organizations that are trying to drive systems change in a number of different areas. And I think it is by pooling donor money that we can get a lot more for each of what we're investing.
Because as you're talking about, I'm thinking of things that we give to, my wife and I give to, well, let's say we're really interested in animal causes. So we're both vegans, we're interested in animal causes. And as we started looking into this space, like who can we support? And it was an absolute minefield of things. And as you're starting to go into it, you're kind of saying, well, that's the really well-known one, but actually if you give money to that, then they've got a very high administrative rate. And actually they're not really, it might look nice and soft and cuddly from the outside, but if you think in terms of, if you just treat it purely by the numbers, so how many years of sentient beings' lives have I saved, then actually that's not the best way of doing it. The best way is going into more activist style of campaigning as well. But it took us, weeks to figure that stuff out. And I thought, well, most people are not going to be really bothered to kind of do that. You just want to say, listen, I want to be able to go somewhere. This is my risk level. This is what's important to me. Invest, go on you go and then show me the quarterly reports.
Yeah, and I commend you for even doing that research. Like you said, I think very few people do that research, and so most people give to the organization that has a nice flashy website or video or something that sounds good, but is not necessarily. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't the organization that's doing the most good. And one of the challenges is if you look at the websites of organizations, they often don't have the kind of data you're talking about like how many lives or animals or whatever that are saved for each dollar that you give. That's not the kind of data that they typically, sometimes they don't even know that exactly. And so people end up focusing on things like the overhead rate, which I actually think is a bad proxy for how effective an organization is. If you think of what goes into an overhead rate, part of what goes into overhead is investing in development of your staff, investing in research and development, investing in infrastructure, things that can help an organization be more productive and get more bang for the buck over time. And so when we squeeze the overhead rates of nonprofit organizations, it means that they're running on a shoestring and they, have to make a lot of short-sighted decisions that don't help them make the biggest impact in the long run.
Now, one of the things you're a proponent for in the book is this idea of an innovation window. This idea that you will, if someone is coming forward with a proposal, that they should be coming forward and building in that, a window that they can be thinking more innovatively, thinking about the question and that as well. So can you explain a little bit about what this innovation window is, how it kind of operates, and what kind of percentage you think organizations should be allocating to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, if you think of a traditional grant, and this is more in the case of grants from a foundation or a government agency than from individuals, traditional grants require you typically to specify upfront in a fair amount of detail what you're going to do. And then, if you win the grant, you get awarded the grant, then you're expected to execute on that. And I call this is like what we call in the software industry the waterfall model. Things happen very serially.
Like
You
a
plan in
project
a lot of
management
detail.
type of, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then you execute on it and then you deliver on it and then you finish, right? And it's not conducive at all to innovation because there's very little flexibility. You're expected to have all the answers up front and then execute on it. And if you think about the kinds of issues that we tackle in the social sector, we're trying to tackle things that are very highly complex, highly dynamic, and often, very intractable and haven't been solved for decades. And so the notion that we can sort of come up with a plan and execute on it and expect that to really move the needle, I think is just inappropriate for the context. So where you have something, where you have a solution that it's just about we need to execute on this and then we will be done. Like for example, vaccinations, that may be something that we understand well enough it's going to work. We just need to get to all the kids, so let's just do it. Then I think you can spend less effort maybe on innovation because you know what to do and you have a solution that's sufficient to the problem. But for most of the challenges that we work on where we don't have a solution that's sufficient, I think what we need to do is certainly there's pressure to deliver in the short term because there's immediate needs, but we should also carve aside some amount of money. And I guess I would argue that the greater the gap between what our solution can offer and what the needs are, the more we should invest in innovation. That by building a window in, so rather than writing a grant and say, I'm just going to execute and do this for this many people, to say, hey, I'm going to set aside 5 or 10% and use that money to innovate, which means essentially to try to figure out how I can do this better. And that can include minor tweaks to what I do. So if I'm training people, maybe it's adding a different module, using a different training technique. And it can also include doing something radically different, maybe trying to do something online that can reach a lot more people. And so that innovation window, I think, is something that is really valuable to build into grant proposals that allows that kind of portfolio approach. Let's deliver on the things that we know how to do, but let's also invest in the R&D that's necessary for us to get much, much better over time.
And also, as you explained there, like the innovation, it doesn't, it can be those small incremental, I think about, for example, cycling, Team Sky, who've been winning all the cycling ones. They just focus on 1% improvements over time on multiple things, and that is based upon compounding, that just is huge. But then you'll have obviously the company you were forming out with Google, they talk about these 10x, those kind of 10x things as well. So I guess that relates to what the risk appetite is of the organization, and where they're sitting just now, almost like what the competitive environment is for those organizations, because those dollars could be going different places.
And like I said, it's a little different in the nonprofit space because we're not necessarily competitive in the market in the same way that companies are. But I would say we should be competitive relative to the need, right? So if, again, you're able to reach all the people with a solution that's sufficient to the need, if you're able to house all the homeless in a sustainable and scalable way, great, do that. But if you're falling far short of that, then and if you're 10x short of the need that's out there, then you should be looking for those moonshots. If you're only 20% off of what the need is, then maybe you should be looking at something more incremental. But I think it's always helpful to look at a kind of portfolio approach of, investing some amount in the things that we know how to do and can deliver today, investing some amount in the incremental improvements that can help us get a little bit better at what we're doing, those 1% or 5% improvements, and then investing some amount in those kind of moonshots of things that can really be transformative. And exactly the mix of percentages, again, I think depends on how far or close you are to really fully addressing the problem that exists today.
Now, as you've been going on your own personal journey as an innovator as well, can you tell us about a time when you worked on something, you gave it your heart and your soul, but for whatever reason it didn't work out like you'd hoped? And more importantly, what was the lesson that you took from that experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. One experience I think of is one that I actually shared with Eric Ries. We worked at a startup company before I joined Google, and we poured everything into this company. We worked night and day building this, what I thought was an ahead of its time platform for transforming the way that we communicate and socialize. And it was a, technically challenging, creatively challenging, and we crafted this beautiful experience. We spent years doing it, and then when we released it, what we found, not surprisingly, was that some people were delighted by it, but then we missed the mark on a few places. The problem was that we had spent so much time and money getting to this big launch that we thought we're going to unveil this to the world, people will just love it, that we didn't have the runway left financially to be able to make all the improvements that were necessary to make it work. And so it's your classic kind of waterfall big bang approach. And I think that maybe scarred both Eric and I, that led us sort of down the different paths that we went down later on in looking for ways that could be much more iterative, where we can learn earlier on what it was that customers would respond to before we made such big investments, and give us more a chance to get to meeting those customer needs.
So finding that product market fit, then really kind of just ensuring that it's there. And then as you were kind of going on this journey as well, can you talk to us about a key aha moment, a light bulb moment? You went, okay, this is what I want to be doing. This is the kind of work I want to be doing. Or you just made a key insight.
Yeah, so after I transitioned over to social good, I spent a lot of time learning. I knew that this was a very different world that I didn't know very much about yet, because I'd been immersed in the tech world for years. And I decided to focus on global poverty, and so set out getting out to see field projects, seeing how the work of global poverty was done in the field. And, when I first went into this space, everyone would come to me looking for me to build an app or a website, because they knew I came from the tech world. And so that's what they thought, I could contribute. And, it had been a long time since I actually wrote software myself. I had been in management for years, so I wasn't even that qualified to do that. So I was trying to figure out, so how could I be useful here? And I remember on a field visit out to Myanmar, it was, talking to people about what they were doing. And they're doing some of the most heroic work, working with smallholder farmers in the Delta of Myanmar, trying to help them, on their small plots of land where they're eking out a living, trying to help them improve their agricultural yields and thereby improve their incomes. And it was inspiring, the work they were doing. And then when I asked them, so how well is it working? How are you going to scale this? They didn't have answers, because the team out there had really, they were on the backside of a grant program where somebody else had written the grant, had a proposal, said this is all the stuff we're going to do, and they were basically executing on that grant. And there was no incentive for them to figure out how to do what they were doing better, to figure out even how well it was working. They were accountable to the number of farmers that they trained or reached. And so it struck me that the whole structure of how we do development and how we execute on grants across the social sector is so counterproductive when it comes to innovation, when it comes to people who are in the field, who understand what is working and not working, being able to apply their creativity, apply their knowledge to doing even better.
So you're now about to kind of traveling around the world, talking about the book, talking about the ideas in the book. So I'm interested. I know a lot of engineers who have had to make that transition, either willingly or unwillingly, but they've actually found they've really enjoyed it, to going and speaking on stages. Because we think of a lot of engineers kind of quieter, focused in that focused individual work they're doing a lot of the time. Suddenly you're having to get up on stage and be, project in that type of way. How have you been finding that part of your journey? Because I'm guessing you're right in that at the moment.
Exactly. And I started that journey not only with the book, but when I moved into government, in my role, it required me to do a lot of public speaking. And yeah, it's something that I was not accustomed to. It's certainly not something you do very much of when you're in engineering. You're kind of in the building behind the walls working on products. And so it's been a big adjustment. And I think practice makes perfect, right? You think getting out there and all I've been able to do is put one foot in front of the other and, just keep doing it, keep trying to get better, keep getting feedback. I mean, sort of like the lean process. To me, it's just you have to get out of the building, do it, get feedback, and try to get better. If you try to be perfect out the gate, you're unlikely to ever even get started. And so it's been a fun journey. And I think the most unnatural thing for me is, especially with the book, people want to know about me and for me to talk about myself. And I've always been the man behind the curtain. And so that's a very sort of uncomfortable experience I'm getting used to.
So you're becoming the agile speaker, as we see this just there. So a couple of final questions as we start to finish up here. I'd love to know if there was one book that you'd recommend to people, not your own book, but a book by another writer. It could be on innovation. It could just be on maybe the bigger side of actually really what we've been talking about, which is doing social good. What would that book be?
A friend, colleague of mine, Anand Giridharadas, just came out with a book called Winners Take All that I think is such a brave book because it tackles this taboo topic of how philanthropy can often be self-serving. And I think he was incredibly brave in writing it. And he's on his book tour a few months before me.
Fantastic. We'll put a link there as well. And I'm not sure how big a music lover you are, but I would love to know if there was one album, one record that you would recommend to our audience. What would that be?
Well, I have to confess, I am very out of date on music. But one album that I keep going back to is Joss Stone, The Soul Sessions. This is from 2003, but I just think her voice is so incredibly rich. It's something I continue to enjoy.
And what about a tool? Obviously, your life has been immersed in tools and apps and things like that as well. Is there an online tool or an app that you found very useful, especially for the process maybe of writing this book and getting the ideas of this book out into the world?
My favorite online tool, and this is very mundane, is Gmail. I was one of the first Gmail users because I was at Google when Gmail was first created. So I got, employees got to pick our own usernames before it was released to the world. For me, everything goes through Gmail. Like I get my emails there, I get my texts there, I get reminders there. And so it's essentially my to-do list. And I love being able to manage everything in one place.
And final question for you. I want you to imagine you woke up tomorrow morning and you have to start from scratch. So you've got all the skills, all the knowledge that you've acquired over the years, but no one knows you. You know no one. What would you do? How would you restart things?
I would probably do exactly what I'm doing today. I feel like I almost did that 7 years ago when I left Google. And it's not that, people knew me in the tech world, but I moved into this whole different world of global poverty and nobody knew me in that space. And I didn't know anybody in that space. And so I really built up my knowledge, built up my networks piece by piece, just by getting out there and talking to people and learning from people and trying to find a way that I could make a difference.
Now, your new book, Lean Impact, is now out. Where's the best place for people to go to find out about the book and also to find out more about you and your other things that you're up to at the moment?
Yeah, we have a website up. It's at leanimpact.org. That's www.leanimpact.org. And check it out. It has all sorts of information there. And hope you'll enjoy the book.
Well, Anne, thank you so much for coming on today and for learning about the book. I'm looking forward to seeing those, I don't know what we're going to call them, index funds for social good investors or something along that line coming out at some point soon as well. But I wish you all the best with the book and the book tour.
Thank you. And thank you so much again for having me today.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.